All right, welcome to another Zoom video call here. Today we've got a couple of great guests, a couple of good friends and colleagues here. TSN's Darren Dreger, TSN Hockey Insider. We've got 18-year NHLer Ray Ferraro, and I saw in your Twitter bio that it says you've now 18 years doing analyst work for TSN. Which 18 years feels longer, Ray?
Longer on my body, the first 18. Longer on everything else, the broadcasting part. I honestly can't believe it that like it's 36 years that I've been around the NHL. I don't know what everybody else feels about their lives, but you're like how could I be one of the older guys all of a sudden? I was always one of the younger guys, and now you're just not anymore.
Hey, I can believe all of us. You know, we all feel like we're still in our 20s or early 30s or something, and something just happened 5 or 10 years ago, and then somebody reminds you, oh yeah, that was 25 years ago. You're like, what the hell's going on?
Wow. And look, I've been around Ray the better part of the 18 years in the broadcast world, and came across him a couple of times as an NHL player. The 18 years around Ray in the broadcast world feels like 36.
Pleasure, Dregs. Yeah, that's why we took on the podcast together. We just couldn't get enough.
Well, this is it, right? This is the other part of it. Is the Ray and Dregs Hockey Podcast? Is it Odio or Odio, or how do I pronounce that? Udio and TSN in a partnership bringing that. The Twitter account is at Ray and Dregs, I believe. Yes, at Ray and Dregs. Yeah. So that's been going on, what, about a year, 2 years? How long has that been going on?
No, less than a year, but I'm jumping in here because, Ray isn't going to talk about himself, obviously. Ray and I have been going back and forth on the idea of a podcast for quite some time. And like 1,000 or 10,000 others decided that this was the year we were going to launch. And I'm going to give a shout out to my partner here because I didn't know what to expect. Coming from a news background for me, content is driven by the stories of the day, the story of the hour, the story of the week. But I don't know that I've ever, in fact, I do know, I've never had more fun doing anything in the broadcast industry than I have had doing this podcast. And the primary reason is, Ray shares his stories and brings on terrific guests, some of his ex-teammates. Guys that he knows well. Sean Podine was terrific. Dean Evison was off the charts with Billy Garrett. Go down the list. It's great to have the top NHL talent. You guys know this. You want to be current, but sometimes your listeners, your podcast viewers, the YouTube followers, all of that, they want to hear those old stories. And Ray has so many of them, and his teammates along the way have been kind enough to share them. So we've had a ton of laughs. It's been highly entertaining.
And as you guys, and we got Jimmy Murphy here too from Boston Sports Now. As you guys both know too, like being TV guys, you feel so much pressure in the TV world, especially when you're doing hits drags, where it's like you got to get this in a minute and a half or 2 minutes or 2.5. Like to finally not to take the governor off and be allowed to just talk for as long as you want and stretch the legs and have a great conversation. And that's the best part of the podcasting thing.
Yeah. It really is. And Ray, you jump in on this. How many times have we said, okay, we're going to keep this to a nice crisp 1 hour. We don't need to go 90 minutes. And then you listen back 2 days later or whenever, and we've gone almost 2 hours and laughed 1,000 times through it.
Well, and on the other hand, we're in the TV world, as you say, Hags, you're sitting there and you've got your instructions. Okay, I've got to cover 3 games. And then the producer says, do it in 90 seconds. You're like, 3 games in 90 seconds, you can barely get the team names out. So it's been fun. We've, when the league paused, the next day we ended up with Donald Fear, the director of the NHL Players Association, and he was fantastic. And then just the other day we had Gary Bettman, the commissioner, on, and I've never seen the commissioner more open or relaxed, or he's not on a podium where everybody's like ding, 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 firing at him. Mm-hmm. And I thought those to me were two conversations you just don't get. And I thought they were both really informative stuff.
Us being on the pause here, what are what's both of your senses of kind of moving forward here, what we're looking at? I know I've heard the July 10th date mentioned as, no camps are going to start before that date. But I'm sure within the next, I would think week to 10 days to 2 weeks, we're going to see, guys on the ice in that first phase coming. Just any sense from either one of you as to where we're sort of headed timeline-wise moving forward?
Well, what we need to find out very quickly, I mean, it's early June, right? And the NHL and the Players Association have indicated that they want to initiate phase 2, bringing players back into NHL cities and getting them onto the ice in those small groups here in early June. Well, that's now.
Yep.
So I think we're going to learn a lot this week and drifting into next week. What we know is, and I mean, you guys are well connected as well. You talked to your sources around the league, and players on their own are starting to come back to their NHL cities. So, as soon as it's safe to initiate phase 2, then the league and the PA is going to do that. The tricky part, though, fellas, is the fact that Canada and its 7 Canadian teams are holding things up a little bit, and that's not on the NHL. Health Canada and the provincial officials and the federal government here in Canada are being incredibly careful. I'm appreciative of that. So is Ray. We live in Canada, but it's gummed things up a little bit. No question about that in terms of the NHL wanting to move forward.
What I saw as well when we talked to the commissioner was that it's like, so they've got this plan, but really the plan is like, if you're building a house, they poured the foundation and they got the studs up. And now they're trying to fill in everything else inside the studs. And each time you finish one thing, there's something else that comes up. And even just in the conversation, you start running your head ahead of what they need to accomplish to get the guys back as safely as possible. Never mind whether you like the format or not, or whether whether the Bruins is by far and away the best team in the regular season or getting the short end of the stick, which they kind of are.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't even matter right now. It's like, can you actually execute what's an incredibly complicated and detailed plan? And for me, that's really what this is first and foremost about, is how do you execute it?
Guys, obviously Minnesota was one of the hub cities, and I would imagine now, since what's happened with the protests and the riots, that won't be the case. But I want to get your take just on how that's affected the NHL. We've seen a lot of players speak up. Obviously, it started with Evander Kane, and it's just gone from there. And it's amazed me how much the NHL as a league has stepped up throughout this past week. I want to get your take on that. If Ray, you want to start first.
Pretty impressive, actually. Evander, I've known him a long time, not very well, but he grew up in Vancouver and played against my son Landon, from the time I think they were 13 years old. And he's always been a really strong voice. And he kind of had his wobbles here and there, but he's really grown up and become, I think, kind of a steady voice, a straight ahead voice in all that's what's going on. What was impressive to me is a player like Blake Wheeler or Logan Couture, a couple of white players that stepped out first and said, hey, this isn't right. We're willing to listen. What can we do to help? And so for the league, I think it's part of building a way forward that helps the league become more inclusionary, that helps the league be as diverse as we really want it to be. I mean, how can you possibly be on a side of inequality? Like, I just don't know how you could be. Yet it's gone on under all our noses forever. I told Dregs, I read this book, maybe the best history book I've ever read. It's called A Team of Rivals. It's about Abraham Lincoln. And the problems that they were fighting and trying to deal with in 1865 were never really dealt with. And so it's all seeping through all of our society. Canada's no different. We have our First Nations that were pushed aside for years and minimized for years. And so the problems that are there that lead into sports are, these guys are now at an age where their voice matters. Their voice should be heard if they feel comfortable going forward with it. And so I can only applaud them. And the one thing that I did see was we can listen, we can do better, and what's the road forward? And I think that's where the league kind of is at now. What it does to the hub cities and all that stuff, man, that's secondary, but it is important because eventually they're going to have to select two places to play.
Well, obviously, this isn't going to help the case of some of the teams that were still in the mix or cities, I should say. And Commissioner Bretman talked to us about this on the Rain Dregs podcast last week, and he put a timeline, as he did with other media outlets, on around a 2-week frame where the league and the PA, mostly the league, would start to carve down those cities. So now we're probably a week away from that, and 3 weeks or 2 weeks away from the NHL making a formal decision on who the 2 hub cities might be. So it's unfortunate. This isn't going to help, but I'm going to echo what Ray said. It's great when professional athletes use the power they have in a positive and a good way on social media. And we definitely are getting that right now. Austin Matthews, tweets, and obviously, he comes from a background where he's going to feel this, but he puts his push behind it. Likewise for the number of players. And I'm going to take you guys back to the general managers meetings in Boca. And I remember talking to Brian McClellan and some other general managers there. And there was a presentation on social media given to the general managers and how powerful it could be. And to a man, those guys, and how many GMs actually use Twitter? I mean, Kyle Dubas comes to mind, but there really aren't that many. Yeah. And to a man, those guys emerged from that meeting blown away by all the good things that you can do. And this is a classic example. But beyond that, to give back, be it to grassroots hockey or, to market. And Brian talked about going back to Washington and making sure that they created a strategy and a platform for everyone associated with the Washington Capitals to jump on board. So I think we're starting to see more and more the value of social media when it comes to some of the celebrity athletes that we're surrounded by.
Well said by both of you guys. And you mentioned the hub cities and, that whole plan that the NHL has moving forward. And I know I had heard whispers of Columbus maybe, being one of the favorites at certain points. Vegas, I've also heard as well. And obviously everything's fluid because, there's still time before they're going to make those final determinations and sort of read the tea leaves of how things are developing here with COVID-19 before they make those final decisions. That's a smart thing to do. What's your sense on the hub cities? But more so, I want to know, what's the craziest sort of thing you've heard tossed out there, possibility-wise, just like theory-wise, somebody, put a plan together or had an idea of what they could do to, a creative way to solve the many hurdles and problems that the league is facing here as they try to thread the needle to make hockey happen. What's the kind of wildest thing that you guys have heard?
Well, I don't know about the wildest thing. I'll let Dregs take the meat and potatoes of this stuff because he, that's what he does. But, there, in Canada, for sure, there's a lot of talk about, could it be Edmonton? Could it be Vancouver? And then you almost hear the medias in each city kind of lobbying for their city. I don't know why it matters. I seem to be missing this whole point because this thing could be on the moon. And the only way you're going to get to see the players or to see the games is to watch it on TV.
Yep.
So what does it matter if you don't get chosen as a hub city? Dregs, I must be missing something because I don't get it. The games are going to be on TV. We're going to watch them on TV. They could be from Columbus or Vegas or, I don't know, Vancouver or Edmonton, or it doesn't even matter to me. I don't get why it's such a big deal.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I mean, maybe we're perhaps a bit jaded because we've been to every city in the National Hockey League and we know the good things of each city. We know the not so good things of each city. I guess it's a feather gap if it's Edmonton or if it's Vancouver, if it's okay for the NHL to embrace the hub city in Canada, and that's a big if. I mean, more and more, it looks like it's going to be 2 American cities, to be completely honest, just because, as we talked about, the Canadian restrictions. But Hags, to get back to your original point, what's some of the wild stuff we've heard? Well, Edmonton is, again, on a full-out campaign. I mean, they've talked about the fact that, they've got 1 million square feet inside their facility. They've got the practice rink there. They can literally put 12 dining areas and separate sanitization areas for all 12 teams inside that building. And then they've got the ice district. And then they've got the JW Marriott, which is a brand spanking new world-class hotel. So everybody can be housed in that. you want to watch a movie on a big screen outside, if it's nice enough, yeah, you can do that at the Ice District, or you can watch some of the other games in the other conference being played, or you can watch the multiple games if you're not involved that are playing. Edmonton went as far as to, and I don't know that they've secured it yet, but they were certainly heavily investigating a private golf course. They're going to take over the golf course so that players and teams on their off days could go and play golf and have some leisure activity as well. So that's about as far out there as I've heard in terms of what life inside that hub will be like.
That should be on TV, though. If the guys are going to play golf, that's what they need to put on TV.
Pay-per-view, just like watching Tom Brady shank shots all day.
Yeah, all you need is one guy to split their pants in the ass, and then you got great viewing.
I mean, dynamic-wise, though, it sounds kind of similar to what Orlando and Disney are trying to do with the NBA, and have everything in one facility and everybody sort of enclosed in one area where they don't have to even go outside their bubble while they're playing, and they have everything for the players there. So you kind of get rid of that whole A, feeling of isolation, and B, the chances, which still seem, likely to me, or at least a good chance of it happening, that players will kind of disregard some of the rules, go outside where they're not supposed to go, and it ends up becoming problematic. That's one of the things I look at and say, how do they combat that with guys that are in their 20s and 30s and, maybe for themselves aren't going to be as worried about the physical COVID-19 issue?
Well, I would say the example is, and the commissioner talked to us about this, is they've had the benefit of seeing the Bundesliga start up and what has happened and how they've gone about, putting the games on, but also how they've had to work around, okay, these are our rules and this is what happens. One of the managers didn't have any toothpaste, so he went out to the drugstore to get toothpaste. He's on quarantine. So I would think, you're going to have, somebody's going to step outside. It's impossible that 24 teams times 30 guys are going to be all perfect at this thing, but you have to lay down the rules, I guess. And if you're the guy stepping outside and you are going to cost your team by going into a 2-week quarantine or a 7-day quarantine, whatever it is, you'll have to deal with those repercussions internally.
Have the players kind of backed off a bit of the fact, they were talking about we don't want to be away from our families that long, and will there be a way to filter us or them in, with testing, what have you? Is that kind of dwindled down a bit? Are they more accepting that might not be possible?
No, I wouldn't say they backed off of that, Murph. Okay. I mean, it's a primary concern. And guys, that's why I feel like, the NHL and the Players Association have worked wonderfully together through this process. I mean, there has been a singular focus, and that is on getting through COVID-19 safely. And then you have the return to play committee with the 5 NHL players. And I thought it was very telling when John Tavares last week on TSN just flat out said, look, we don't know what the world in the hub city is going to look like. And he didn't say this, but one of the early concerns, of course, as you guys know, was, having availability, having access to your family. And how do you do that as close to risk-free as you can, because you're never going to be 100% risk-free. I think that's where things could get a little bit snarly here in the next little bit here, because here's what we know. We know that a good portion of NHL players, those involved in the 24-team field, they want to compete. Who doesn't want to win the Stanley Cup? Every player who plays in the National Hockey League plays because they want to win the cup, and the money is great on top of that. But when they start to learn what inside that hub, what that world is going to look like, what some of the restrictions are, what sort of access they're going to have to their family, all of those things, I think that's when you're going to get the undercurrent of the player who maybe doesn't want to play, doesn't want to play at all this year. He just wants to stay and pause, make sure the world is safe, and then kick off 2020-21 when it's safe to do that. There's a number of those guys out there, and not just Max Domi, Kaapo Kakko, and all the guys with underlying health issues. There are a number of players out there. They just haven't surfaced yet because they don't know what the restrictions are going to be. But I think we're going to start to hear from those players in the weeks ahead.
It wouldn't surprise me at all if there ends up being guys that don't play, or, that just say, you know what, for my own health or my family's health, or I want to be with my family while this is going on. I think we'll probably see this with all the major sports, that they decide that they're going to sit it out until things get a little more normal.
So what do you think? Will fans say, I get that, or will they be sour at the player? I don't see that this is going to be grandly accepted.
Yeah.
Because I think, the fans want their guys for their team playing all the time. It's like you almost forget their people too with families. Like, what happens if somebody's wife is expecting?
Yeah.
Like, can you leave to go be there for the birth? I don't see how you could do that, but this is where, as Dreg said, it's going to get incredibly complicated in rather short order.
I mean, this is a crazy theoretical because nothing like this was going on when you were playing, right? But what would it be like? What do you think the conversation would be like inside a dressing room if a guy did decide, you know what, I just, for whatever reason, I can't play right now, and games are going forward anyway?
Well, I played in the 80s and 90s, and which are far different than today. And I would suspect guys wouldn't have been very happy with, if 18 of us are playing and 2 aren't. Why aren't you playing?
Yeah.
It doesn't strike me, Hags, that it would be the most accommodating view of the guys. And that puts incredible pressure on people that maybe just aren't very comfortable. Like, it's one thing to say, oh, I would do this or I would do that. But when you're put to the test of it, like when you're put to, hey, are you going in or are you staying home? Some guys aren't going to go. I mean, I would think it would be incredibly remarkable if all 500 players said, oh yeah, we're all going in.
Yeah.
That to me would seem more unlikely than the other way.
As far as let's say they do start playing, and we still obviously don't know if it's definitely going to happen, but let's say it happens, 24 teams, the vast majority of the players play. Do you guys have any sense of what might play into an advantage for teams, what might play into a disadvantage for teams, who might fare best in these situations? I mean, we hear Mark Recchi say that he thinks that the older experienced guys are going to take it a little more seriously, be a little bit mentally tougher, and maybe be able to, push through some of the really unorthodox things that these players are going to have to deal with, whether it's empty arenas, being away from their families, all that stuff. Brad Marchand told us last month or 6 weeks ago that he thinks the older teams are going to struggle and that young teams like Toronto are going to have an advantage because they're going to bounce back with their skating legs faster. Clearly a team like Tampa Bay that was not going to have Stamkos in the playoffs and would get him back now, that's a big help to them. I mean, how do you think it plays out when they do start playing as to what teams might have an advantage or disadvantage?
My thought is this has been so long that the guys will be away that there's going to be some wild unpredictability to it. I'll give you a quick example. Say a guy has had a career year. We see them every year. Somebody scores 30 goals out of nowhere. And then over the summer, they revert back to what they normally are and they score 16 goals the following year. Well, this is like an off season. So a player, it's actually longer than an off season. So a player that might be rolling along in March, he might be the old guy in July and August, right? It might be completely different. So my feel is, while it's going to be wildly unpredictable at times, the best teams are still going to be the best teams. Yeah. Like if you don't have a number one goalie, or if you didn't have a top defenseman, they didn't just show up over the last couple of months, right? You're still the same team. And if you're a team like the Bruins, who are deep and strong and they've got good goaltending and they've got lots of depth, they're still going to be the Bruins. That's how I think the best teams are still going to be the best teams.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Look, I'm going to be fascinated to see how the first round plays out. Call it whatever you want. I mean, some are referring to it as a playoff round. Commissioner Bettman prefers that the rest of us use qualifying round. And then, of course, you've got the round robin for the top 4 teams in each conference. Spoke to Nathan McKinnon about this last week, and he's just happy to be talking hockey again and is looking forward to getting back on the ice. Likes the format because as a top team in the Western Conference, he saw no value in getting a bye. I guess the only thing that he wondered about, and I'm stealing it from him, is are you going to have the same level of intensity in that round robin that you're going to have in the qualifying round? Because ultimately, it'll likely end up being a reseeding formula. So you're playing for something in the round robin, but you're not playing for your postseason lives. Like, I mean, those best of fives in that qualifying round, the hockey may be rusty, but it's going to be intense, whatever that level of intensity looks like. And that might be a bit of an advantage to the teams that advance from the qualifying round into the field of 16, as opposed to the round robin conference teams that didn't have that same level of competitiveness.
Yeah, I think I tend to balance about how much a coach is worth, like how much a coach can really impact change. I think this is why you pay your coaches millions of dollars. Like, you have to be able, as the leader, to get your group, even though these round robin games won't be the same, to buy in, to check in. And so when those coaches of the round robin teams start formulating their camp, they're going to have to find a way, best as they can, to ramp up intensity, ramp up conflict in practice. So the guys have to learn to battle again, because I know, or I remember from playing, you get back out in the summer, which is basically what's happening, and some guy runs into you and you feel offended. You're like, hey, wait a minute, man. For 4 months, I've been kind of skating around doing whatever I want. Here's some guy doesn't want me to go there. And you're going to have to ramp that up so you're ready when you get your matchup against a team out of the play-in round, that you're as close to ready to go as they will be.
Guys, going back to what we were saying about them pretty much being on an even playing field when they come back or on the ice. You look at the Columbus Blue Jackets, that's the one team I'm a little curious about, and I wonder if you agree, it's just because of how healthy they're going to be now compared to what they were when this pause happened. Do you want to be the Toronto Maple Leafs there? I mean, did they get the toughest draw out of anyone?
They might get the most surprising team out of it, right? The most unpredictable team. I thought John Tortorella should be a finalist for the Coach of the Year, given what he did with Columbus, basically coaching their American League team. I mean, they didn't have both goalies at the same time. They were without Seth Jones for a large portion of the season. Cam Atkinson, their leading goal scorer, he's been gone forever. They were down 7 guys. And so now, if you're Toronto, I would expect, a season that has been really kind of disappointing because they expected much more. You're going to run into I would suspect, is kind of a buzzsaw in Columbus. That's going to be a hard series.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with that. And we had Jarmo Kekalainen on TSN 1050 late last week and peppered him with, some of those competitive, comparisons with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and without showing his hand or the Columbus Blue Jackets hand too much, he said, look, we're going to be healthy with the exception of Josh Anderson. I mean, that's a long-term thing. He may not be ready to go right out of the gate whenever that gate swings open. But the goaltending card is going to be an interesting one because in Columbus, it's going to be who's ready, who is the sharpest, and we're riding a hot tender. In Toronto, maybe, but if Freddie Anderson doesn't stand on his lid, then the Toronto Maple Leafs are going to have an issue. As high-powered as the offense is in Toronto, that is going to be one of the more intriguing series for me to watch in terms of how it plays out.
Maybe one thing, just one last point on that.
Yeah.
I think the games are going to look a little bit like October games to start, a little scrambly and a little
flat,
messy and messy. Like nobody's really into their systematic play yet. That might help a team like Toronto too.
Wrapping this up, thank you very much for the time. And let's finish with some hockey stories. I know Murph and I have covered the league for a long time. I think my favorite story involving Murph is when Eddie Belfour threw his pads at him. I think for me, it's probably just Sean Thornton on a monthly basis, good-naturing, threatening me with bodily harm, depending on what mood he was in that day. But Dregs, your favorite person to cover, your favorite hockey story in the time that you've covered the league, just dealing with a hockey player?
Well, I mean, favorite person to cover is Mike Babcock, just because I've covered him at every level of hockey, dating back to the Western Hockey League, right? And I've had him in the Dreger Cafe at the World Championships, probably too many times for his liking, because that speaks to the fact his teams weren't going deep into the playoffs, and can't wait to get hands on him again from a broadcast perspective, because he's got some stories to tell. But the only time that I can recall where I mean, look, we've all had disagreements with players, you know, either they don't like the question that you're asked or whatever, but those are nothing. Those are disagreements. Chris Phillips, when he was first drafted by the Ottawa Senators, they couldn't make a deal. So he was going back to junior hockey, didn't entirely want to go back to junior hockey. His agent at the time was Stacey McAlpine. He calls me in Winnipeg. I'm working in Winnipeg, and he says, hey, Chris Phillips is coming to Winnipeg, and there's a good chance he's going to sign with the Manitoba Moose. Randy Carlyle was the coach and general manager of the Manitoba Moose. Winnipeg Arena, which isn't here anymore, and neither is Stacey McAlpine for that matter, but it was right across the street from CKY Television where I worked. So here I go, building's open, me and my cameraman, Kurt, we're waiting near the Manitoba Moose dressing room. And we're not ambushing anybody. I mean, we're just standing in the middle of the hallway, and now we can hear the voices. So I said to my cameraman, we'll get rolling because, you know, I want to get some B-roll of these guys walking up. Well, it's dark, but he's got the light on. Here we see Randy Carlisle's got a, you know, bunch of sticks over his shoulder, Chris Phillips sticks. He's helping him out. Phillips has his hockey bag, and there's Stacey McAlpine. Well, Randy sees us, and the expletives start flying. What the are you doing here? Yeah. And he got to a point in about 10 seconds where he made a lunge for the camera. So I'm a prairie boy, and my temper in my late 20s, early 30s was sketchy at best. So I stepped up and I grabbed his arm and I said, hey, don't touch the camera. Anyway, end of a long story. There was literally a negotiation back then between my bosses at CKY TV and the Manitoba Moose as to how much of that footage we were going to go to air. So the trade-off was we didn't.
I mean, that's gold for TV dregs right there.
I know, and look, I almost resigned. I was so pissed off because they made a deal that Chris Phillips would come back to the station. We'd get an interview with Chris Phillips one-on-one as long as we didn't show any of that nasty footage. So anyway, that was my moment. And you know what? Randy Carlyle, I mean, it's only been the last few years where he's okay with me. He was still angry at me when he was coaching the Toronto Maple Leafs. That's how long he can hold a grudge.
I like it.
I would say one of my favorite things was, you know, I do a lot of games from between the benches. And so at the start of each period, I have a little highlight pack of something that happened in the first period, and I blah, 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 do whatever. So it's a game in Los Angeles, Vancouver's playing. And Alex Edler has had one of those periods where it's like he's got his skates on the wrong feet. He's on for a couple of goals against, and he's taken a penalty or two. So I'm just getting ready to start. The players aren't back on the ice, and here come the Canucks. They come out, and they're to my right. So the defensemen sit closest to where I'm standing. Edler happens to be the first guy out. And so he comes down and kind of swishes himself down the bench and slides down the bench. And he's kind of in a decent mood. And he goes, and he looks at the camera and he goes, oh, is that a highlight pack for me? And I go, yeah. And he goes, of the first period? And I said, yeah, it's not very good. And he goes, I won't watch. And he just looks straight ahead. I was so nervous because I had one thing that I was going to say, but now he's sitting right there. So I'm like, no, he really struggled in that first period. You know, he's a good guy. You know, like I just didn't want to bury the guy while he's sitting a foot and a half away. He thought it was hilarious how bad he was, and that he came and saw the footage sitting right in front of him of what that period looked like.
Oh, that is the absolute worst. Where I have to set up to do live shots for NBC is in the media, like dining room press conference area now. Every player walks right by the door that is wide open on their way down the stairs and out of the garden. So half the time post game when I'm on TV, if it's a loss and somebody didn't play well and I'm roasting them, I can see out of the corner of my eye like Zdeno Chara giving me a dirty look as he's, you know, scowling as he's walking by, like what the hell? And you know,
it's amazing how your body temperature. We're amazing how your body temperature goes up. You know, they're just looking at you on the way by, and you're like, ugh. bad timing.
Boys, thank you very much for the time. I really appreciate it. And Dregs, I now know not to touch your camera ever. That's just something I'm never going to cross that line.
Don't touch my camera, Hags. You leave my camera alone.
Loyalty.
Thank you, boys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for the time.
Be
Take
well,
care.
guys. Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.